Okay. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn session. Okay, today, as promised last session, okay, we'll discuss a topic, okay, not very corporate, but it do touch, okay, an important topic under the Companies Act, okay, but this case will be more to remedies, okay, damages arising from a breach of a share sale agreement and the evidence, all right? Okay. Dato' Ismail bin Othman, okay, a High Court case. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, let's go to the facts of a share sale agreement, okay, with second and third defendants in somewhere in April 2016 to buy the second and third defendants' shares for 10 million. So the purchase price of 10 million, okay, will not paid by cash as usual, but will be paid by shares of this Seqera Group Berhad. Okay, we call it Seqera shares, okay. So this share sale agreement, SSA, was conditional. There was condition to be fulfilled, okay, within 3 months from the date of the SSA. So the 3 months has passed, okay, the initial 3 months has passed, and further extension was given, okay, and a few extensions up until December 11, 2016 also went past, but still the conditions precedent were not fulfilled. Next slide. So on May 16, 2017, the plaintiff wrote to the second and third defendants, okay, telling them, okay, no need to, okay, comply the conditions precedent waiver, and then quickly requested the share sales to be transferred to him. But the second and third defendants replied, saying that the share sale agreement had lapsed, okay, automatically on December 11, 2016, okay, which is the final date of extension that parties had negotiated. So there was no issue of waiver or compliance of CP anymore, right? So plaintiff in this case is not claiming for breach of the share sale agreement, but instead is claiming for damages arising from 2 transactions that he entered after entering the SSA. Okay, what are the 2 transactions? Next slide. Okay, the first transaction, okay, somewhere in May 2016, the plaintiff paid a sum of RM5 million to Seqera. According to him, it's at the request of the first defendant, okay, to subscribe 5 million units of Seqera shares pursuant to a private placement exercise. So the shares were subscribed in the name of the first defendant. Okay, get the facts, huh? So second transaction, next slide. 31st May, okay, there are 2 occasions, okay. Plaintiff, according to his version, is at the request of the first defendant, transferred to JF Apex Securities Berhad, okay. Who is this Apex, JF Apex? It's a stockbroking company, okay, where they also provide margin financing to purchase shares, okay. So they transferred a sum of 5 million, okay, 3 million and 2 million each occasion to subscribe 10 million units of Seqera shares, okay, at RM1 per unit. And margin account also opened under the name of the first defendant. Okay, so the tenure for this arrangement is for 12 months, okay, from the date of disbursement. And then the plaintiff will, in this case, plaintiff will bear the monthly interest and charges on the loan. And the facility was also to be secured by a charge over the 5 million shares or during the first transaction. Remember he first subscribed to 5 million shares, right? So that was to be placed for security. All right, next slide. Okay, so the plaintiff demanded for the for his claim, plaintiff demanded from the first defendant, okay, for the payment of 10 million, okay, arising out of that two transactions lah. So the plaintiff claimed that they were loans actually made to the first defendant at the defendant's request. And similarly, also claim against second and third defendants. Okay, they are directors of the first defendant, so they are alter ego of the first defendant. Next slide. Okay, but the defendant also defend. Okay, they also contest. They said they denied that loan. They are not options, in fact, arrangement by the plaintiff to Sekira shares are actually purchased and the defendant. In the event that the share sale agreement did not proceed, the first defendant will keep the Sekira shares. Okay, that's a collateral agreement between the parties. Next slide. Okay, but from the facts, okay, what was further revealed is that the defendant, the second defendant, testified in the courts that the plaintiff did inform him that he needed to subscribe the shares of Sekira under placement, private placement facility. Then need to open that under the first defendant's name. And it's not disputed also that the parties had, plaintiff had assured the second defendant that he has paid, he has and he will pay. Okay? In fact, he has been paying the fees and monthly charges and interest under the account open under the first defendant's name. And the second defendant testified that it would be illogical, in this case, for the first defendant at its own initiative to subscribe to Sekira shares, because in the open market, it's only sold for 86 cents. Why would it want to buy these Sekira shares through this private placement, which is more expensive, RM1 each, per share? Okay. Continue. Next slide. Second and third defendants also, previous, yes, had already agreed to sell their entire shareholdings, to the first defendant, to the plaintiff. So there's no reason for the first defendant to purchase the Sekira shares at all. So as to the reason why the first defendant gets to keep the shares is that the first defendant, he was aware of this transaction, the arrangement with GFFX, right? So he assumed the risk of non-payment, to GFFX. So in fact, the second defendant testified that GFFX had made a demand, after the 12 months. Remember, it's for 12 months period. So it's expired somewhere, it's due somewhere in May 2017. So they demand for the first defendant for the repayment outstanding sum under the margin facility. And pursuant to that demand, the first defendant sold off the Sekira shares. So there were indeed, in fact, monies remaining from the proceeds of sale, after paying off amount due to GFFX. Next slide. So in essence, defendant's story is that the first and second transactions, claimed by plaintiff, is to secure the purchase consideration. It's a purchase consideration, as agreed under the SSA, right? The shares of the second and third defendants are to be paid by Sekira shares. So plaintiff, on the other hand, says the transactions were is a loan to the first defendant, so that the Sekira shares can be procured earlier. So by the time then the conditions precedent will comply, then they can immediately transfer the shares to plaintiff already. So that's what was intended. So this each side got their story. Next slide. So what the court find from here, how the court see this case. So the court needs to see whether the first and second transactions claimed by plaintiff are in fact loan or not. Is it a loan made to the first defendant? So the court said that the first and second transactions cannot be loan made to the first defendant, okay, because, okay, this field. Okay. Firstly, it was inconsistent with the plaintiff's version that the Seqera shares subscribed by the first defendant was intended to be purchase consideration. Okay. And if it's a loan for the first defendant as claimed by plaintiff, shares belong to the first defendant. So what defendant would do if it's a loan? It would be in fact providing financial assistance, okay, for the second and third defendants to purchase the share of Seqera. Okay, so this would be contravention of section 123 of the Companies Act. Later we'll see what is this, what does this section say, okay? Next slide. And if payment, but if the payment are according to, say, okay, according to the defendant's version, they are subscription by the plaintiff of Seqera shares, but in the name of the first defendant, then this version will be consistent with the plaintiff's version that the shares were purchase consideration to buy the second and third defendant's shares of the first defendant under the share sale agreement. So there's no reason why the first defendant would procure loan, okay, from the plaintiff to subscribe to Seqera shares at RM1 per unit, okay, when open market price is 86 cents. Okay, they could just buy from open market. And further, if it's a loan at the request of the first defendant, there's no reason for plaintiff to bear the fees, charges, monthly interest. Okay, why is the plaintiff bearing? Okay, if it's a loan from the first defendant, it should be the borne by first defendant, right? And if the two transactions were loaned to the first defendant, the repayment will be due in May 2017. Okay, but there's no demand made by plaintiff. Next slide. Okay, the plaintiff only made a claim to the loan somewhere in 2018. Okay, that also when the defendant asked for a copy of the loan document, plaintiff did not give. Okay, there's no further, there's no director resolution. Okay, if a company want to obtain loan, they have to have a director's resolution, right? There's no such resolution. And then when due diligence was conducted, okay, audited accounts did not show that there's the first defendant taking loan. Again, okay, so all this and further, the loan agreement, okay, if it's signed, okay, it should be signed, right, by the defendant if it was taken. But the signature of the loan agreement was not witnessed by anyone. Okay, there is initial, okay, of the first of the plaintiff, but there's no initial of the second defendant's initial under the agreement, in the agreement. All right, next slide. So based on this, okay, the courts conclude that the plaintiff failed to prove his claim. Okay, there was no loan. It's actually a purchase consideration. All right, okay. Then the claim was dismissed with cost of RM5 50K. So what's the point of discussing this case is that, you see, from whether it is a financial assistance or not, okay, it depends with how very much, okay, on how the counsel argue the facts of the case. So it's a very fact-based, whether it's a loan, whether it's amount to a financial assistance, okay, in contravention of section 123 of the Companies Act. Okay, we shall see, following slide is a comparison with another case, 2020 case. Next slide. Okay, Inge Tibrewal against Nader. There are other few more cases, but for time constraint, okay, I'll compare these two cases, right? These two cases, again, the court held that this is a contravention. Okay, so you can see the examples. Okay, what amounts to financial assistance in contravention of section 123 of the Companies Act. Okay, in this case, okay, it's a High Court case 2020. The first and second plaintiff in this case are directors and shareholders of the third defendant. Okay, the defendant, you see, Al Soraya Commerce is a company. Okay, so they own 49% shares of the company. And then the first and second defendants hold 51% shares of the company. Okay, so you see the parties are all directors and shareholders of the company. there's also Ramanathan, okay, and Maheswari, where Ramanathan is also the secretary of the company. Next slide. All right, the companies own three properties here. Okay, there's this lot 2.03, 2.07, and Megan Avenue. Okay, so in this case, plaintiff filed this suit. Not filed this suit. It's an earlier suit filed by plaintiff. Okay, we call it first consent judgment. Okay, filed against Ramanathan and the defendants, and a consent judgment was entered. Okay, earlier in 2017. So what was agreed, okay, by the parties under this first agreement is that the three properties are to be valued. Okay. And then from the value, after minus the bank loans, okay, so that will be a portion 60% and 40%. Okay, 60% to plaintiff and 40% to second and third defendants in the event the property was sold. Okay, so second and third defendants are to transfer, okay, their shares in the company to the first plaintiff. Okay, of course, upon they get the 40%. The defendants and Ramanathan, okay, after transfer their shares, they are due to resign as directors. Okay, actually, the big picture is for the plaintiff to take over the company, right? The plaintiff, the properties shall be sold either plaintiff buy or defendant buy. Okay, either one buy, they will have to distribute the proportion of the share 60-40. Okay, that means if the plaintiff is the one buying, so they will pay 40% to the defendants, and the defendants will transfer their shares and then resign as director in the company. Okay, next slide. Okay, so funding from the purchase consideration, okay, for the plaintiff acquisition of the first and second defendant shares are to be derived from the sale of that three pieces of properties. So parties could not agree to how the valuation to be made, when, who to appoint, or what. Okay, there's no detail, okay, of how valuation should be done under the first consent judgment. Okay, so parties cannot agree. So again, the plaintiff filed a second suit. Okay, so plaintiff filed a second suit. The second suit was party negotiate for settlement and entered consent judgment. So these are the terms of the second, we call it second consent judgment. Okay, so the court gave direction after means parties agreed that after obtaining valuation report, the first and second defendant will have the first option. Okay, they will have the first choice whether they want to purchase that property or not. Okay, they will give a 14 days notice to plaintiff. And if the first and second did not exercise within that time period, then the option will go to plaintiff, okay, to purchase the property, the three properties. So valuation was done, okay, and then the defendants gave notice to purchase the property to the plaintiff. Okay, but in the notice of purchase, it states that the purchaser is this Jago Bina Corporation instead of the defendant. Next slide. So plaintiff dispute okay, the notice because it's not according to what was agreed in the second consent judgment. It should be the defendant who is going to buy the property. Right? So after rejecting the notice to purchase sent by the defendant, plaintiff themselves go and send, they will want to buy the 40% for the value of property as agreed in the first consent judgment. This one was not accepted by the defendants, so they reject it. So this plaintiff filed the action, seeking to get the first and second defendants to transfer their shares in the company on the ground that basis, okay, the properties by the Jago Bina offer. Next slide. Next slide. So the court finding is that, okay, plaintiff in this case challenged the validity of the option, okay, because parties in that, Jago Bina was not a party to the consent judgment. Okay, why suddenly put the purchaser is Jago Bina? Okay, and purported option include a deduction of outstanding sum due to this Ramanathan. No, that was not the terms under the consent judgment. Okay, so but okay, it's not disputed. Whoever, okay, either plaintiff buy or defendant buy the properties purchased, okay, they are looking at the proceeds from the sale, right, to finance the purchase of the defendant's shares. Because if there's no sale of the properties, there's no transfer of the shares, right? So if that is the case, this is an arrangement that clearly contravenes Section 123 of the Companies Act. Okay, we keep mentioning Section 123 of the Companies Act. What does it say? Next slide. Okay, it provides that unless, okay, otherwise provided under this act, a company shall not give any financial assistance, whether directly or indirectly, okay, by whatever means, loan, guarantee, security, otherwise, okay, for the purpose of or in connection with purchase of any shares in the company. Okay, the net was cast quite wide, okay, in whatever form. Okay. Next slide. So in this case, okay, it's very clear, right? Okay, what kind of financial assistance is there? It's in the form of the property. So they use property to finance the purchase of the shares, but the plaintiff would get all the shares, okay, from the transferred by the second and third defendants. That was what was arranged. Okay, so and pursuant to Section 123 also, if it is found to be contravention of Section 123, okay, the court was also of the opinion that any transaction in contravention of Section 123 shall be void in this case. Okay, so it declared that transaction was null and void, okay, under Section 24E of the Contracts Act. So you compare this, okay, with what was provided under Section 124 of the Companies Act, which says if a company gives financial assistance in contravention of this subdivision, the validity of the financial assistance, okay, or any contract or transaction enacted shall not be affected only because of the contravention. So to see this, the law on this are whether the effect or the impact of this transaction, okay, if it contravenes Section 123, is it void or is it valid? It's still not settled, you see, okay? All right, of course, the court has its own rationale why it declared this void, okay, because it doesn't want to lend its hand, okay, for something that is illegal. Okay, that's the rationale of the court. But we shall see, okay, whether there's an appeal from parties, okay, for this case. I think the law is not very settled yet on the impact, all right? So we shall see if there any further development of this, right? Next slide. Okay, so the takeaway is that financial assistance in relation to purchase of shares can take in many forms. Okay, of course, these are just one or two examples that we are discussing. Okay, it can be by way of margin financing, as in the case of the first case. Okay, but the court in that case held that it was not, right? It was not a loan, or using the company's assets, as what happened in this, okay, the later case. But it's a very I would say it's a very case-to-case basis because it's a very factual, okay, whether it contravenes Section 123. In fact, in the case of just now, the first one, very conflicting by itself, okay, it looks like it is not a loan, but if argue further that it can be also be a loan, actually, right, from the facts. So they are quite it depends how the parties they argue whether it's loan or not, right? And all right, that would be my discussion. Is there any questions, any comments, feedback on this case? No? Okay, if no, then I thank you very much for your attendance. Okay, if there's any question, you can always ask me later, pursuant to the case or the law on this, principle on this. Okay, all right. Hope to see you next session. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Yang Li.